If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Bro, we made it to 2020. It's crazy, man.
It's been a
Just
time
thinking
flies.
about. Oh my goodness, man! Like you just hearing 2020, thinking back to like, you know, when I was like a teenager, thinking about
Y2K?
how far away, you know. Yeah,
Y2K.
exactly. That's a perfect example, right? Like, you know, we were like, you know, I would have been 15 in Y2K, and you know. Remember, you know, I'm thinking of like when I was like 11, 12, you're like, oh my goodness, Y2K, like year 2000, right? Just like, and you're like, oh my goodness, that was more than half of my life ago.
Right, yeah. 20 years.
You know, I actually had that, I had that kind of thought of like, oh, that was over half of my life ago, a couple times in the last like little while. I don't know why I end up reminiscing about, you know, something in high school, or maybe it was something my niece did or something that just made me think about it. But I was like, yeah, it's like, I don't know. I'm making myself sound like I feel like I'm old right now, but
well, you are, man. You're wise. You're an old wise man.
I know. Yeah.
No, that's crazy.
I don't know. I'm doing adult things. That's true.
Yeah, no. Yeah, you're right. Because I think about 2000, and now it's 2020. Yes, the year goes by fast, but 20 years went by very fast. And of course, everybody has at their end of the year lists. But since we're going into, we just finished a decade, everybody has their all decade list, or for the last 20 years or last 10 years. Greatest musicians, greatest sports plays, most influential person. So this is a good conversation to have. But for the listener, Joel and I were having a conversation about, you know, preparing for the episode and narrowing down the timeline. So the argument for the show is the 5 most impactful things that happened that in the last 5 years that'll impact the next 5 years for the Canadian economy. The reason why we didn't do the 10 years is because the first half of the decade, the last decade, won't have as great of an impact on the next decade going into 2020.
Yeah. It just made more sense. I mean, we wanted to do something unique in this, you know, we didn't want to just come out with another list. And, you know, so by doing let's call it a unique list, or taking a unique perspective on reflecting on the last decade and saying, how is it going to be forward looking? We kind of developed this idea that, or we kind of came to the conclusion that really the stuff in the beginning of the decade is unlikely to be impactful in the next decade, but the stuff in the last 5 years will be more impactful for the next 5 years.
That's good. Okay, so should we leave it as a surprise, or we could just let them know what the 5 topics are going to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're probably going to, if they look at
the show notes.
If they look at the show notes, I'm sure they'll figure it out. But for the person who wants suspense, let's just start running through it.
Okay.
So
all right, that's good.
Number 5.
Number 5. Hold on.
Roll
the drums. I don't know if that sounded like a drum.
No, that sounded like, I don't even know, man. It was like, it was pretty weak in there.
Well, actually, Anthony plays drums. We could have got Anthony to give us a drum roll. Okay, so at number 5, we have the Toronto Raptors winning the NBA Championship in 2019. Why is that significant, Joel?
The biggest thing is regarding how much Canada came around the team. Similar to what happened with the Blue Jays a couple of years ago when they were...
Couple years? That was in the 90s,
runs.
Man.
No, dude. Okay.
The last time when the Blue Jays went back to back?
No. I said when they were on playoff runs.
That's not the same.
All of that to say, Toronto Blue Jays, when they made the playoffs for a couple years in a row, there was like this whole Canada support. Now you take a team that had that level of support because they're the only team in the league and actually winning the championship.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to draw a parallel with the Canada-wide support, not the championship side of the team. So I think the biggest impact is going to be just inspiring more and more kids to be. And I've got a few articles that I found. One was from, I think it was TSN, and then another was from, I don't know, this website called Raptors Rapture. It's kind of random, but both just talking about the long-term impact of the team winning. And they had some good quotes. The one that I took really from the Raptors Rapture website basically made something to the effect that they're going to inspire a new generation of basketball talent, similar to Vince Carter at the dunk competition.
Mm-hmm.
And then the TSN article actually said, referencing the Vince Carter era, saying it took over 10 years for us to truly see and appreciate the effect that Carter had on basically basketball in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where we're going to see the biggest impact, is just inspiring more kids to get into basketball.
Yeah. I would also add that I think being a part of a championship organization is a pretty big deal, and everybody wins. So we saw that socially in how the whole country was united. We had our Jurassic Parks, right? So for those people who couldn't afford to get into the game, they would they set up these huge TVs, and then a lot of people would watch the game from outside, and so they would start calling that Jurassic Park, which started outside of the Air Canada Center. So what you saw was people from outside the Air Canada, did I say Air Canada? It's Scotiabank. Scotiabank.
Don't worry, I still call it the Skydome.
Scotiabank Arena. So you have people sitting outside Scotiabank Arena watching the game. You had people in Mississauga sitting outside watching the game, Pickering, Halifax, Saskatoon, our hometown Brampton. It's crazy when watching it on TV and seeing a whole country united, and everybody just had, it was almost like Christmas for those people who have never been a part of a championship organization. It was like Christmas around Toronto. Everybody was in a good mood, everybody was sharing, everybody was talking, it was a really good feeling.
The city had a good vibe.
Oh man, yeah. No, it was straight positivity until that one ninja shot up the parade. But anyways, I'm not gonna give that guy any clout. So.
Oh yeah. That was crazy.
Yeah.
But anyways.
Right. But anyways, but we also see economically all the money that came into the country. So there was an article that said, in terms of hard numbers, and the ripple effects of the playoffs on the economy proved fruitful. Last week, StatsCan released figures that show the Raptors helped Canada's economy during the month of May, contributing to increasing the GDP by 0.2%. The economy grew more than economists expected during this time frame, with a 0.5 increase in the arts and entertainment industry and a 0.4 jump in the accommodation and food services playing a notable role. These sectors include sporting event ticket sales, as well as attendance at TV screen-filled bars and restaurants across the country. So according to credit and debit processing firm Moneris, transactions in Ontario bars and restaurants increased by 23% during Game 6 of the Eastern Conference Finals between the Raptors and the Milwaukee Bucks. And then in Toronto, this figure climbed as high as 76%. Most notably, however, in Vancouver, they peaked a whopping 90%. And then in Calgary was 79%, revealing the strength of nationwide fan base, right? And that's not even talking about the tourism when people were coming here to watch the games and take in the culture.
Yeah, I mean, here's one of the like, when you look at something like StatsCan, just a bit of a sidebar. If you're really trying to measure economic effect, the problem is, did we just take the money from Sally and give it to John? Right? So not so much the tourism piece, right? People coming to this country is, let's say, not spending money in the US and they're spending money here. But if I'm spending money to watch a Raptors game instead of go to a movie, it's not really an increase in economics or economic wealth or economic spending. It's just a movement of spending that's one is measurable, but you can it's I mean, in economics, the idea of opportunity cost, right? What did I give up in order to do that? When I took the money out of the US and came to Canada, okay, that's great for Canada. But if they're only able to measure that, there was an increased spending in, let's just call it entertainment for simplicity.
Right.
Well, what did they take from? Or did they take something? Did they take out of their savings? Did they take, where did that extra spending come from? A bit of a sidebar, I don't want to go down that road too much, but me being an economist-oriented type of thinker, as soon as I read that, Stats Canada is going to be purely numbers, and there's an inability to really capture opportunity cost. Just because it's too hard to measure because, everybody's going to pull from a different place, assuming they're substituting spending from one place to another. It's not going to be consistent. It's not like everyone's going to stop spending money, on food in order to watch the Raptors. So it's going to be, this guy stopped here. This guy didn't buy his lottery ticket this week, whatever it is, right? Like, it's going to be all over the place. But the thing I thought was really cool was just like, with regards to whole Canada being behind them, is the fact that they had Jurassic Parks around the country, right? So yeah, in Toronto, there's an aspect of, for the people who can't afford to go to the game, there's a Jurassic Park, but Vancouver is having a Jurassic Park, or, places where people live too far to even come to the game unless they're going to fly, which is essentially only the upper class who can really do that for the most part. And that's where I just thought the hype was going to be, that's where the impact is coming from. There's so much hype around the team that the sport itself is going to see an uptick. And then in the long run, like that other quote I read said, it might take 10 years for us to see the fruit of a 10-year-old who starts, loving basketball, becoming,
That's true.
an NBA player.
No, it's true. It's true. We're definitely going to see the fruits of that.
One of the articles, I think it was, I don't remember which one. I think it was actually the TSN article. They referenced another article that talked about, actually it was the Rapture article that basically referenced an article that said basketball could become this country's top sport, overtaking hockey. And so that was a CTV News article. And, it's an interesting perspective. I think it depends on how you look at it. I mean, is it how you're going to measure Canada's national sport? I mean, technically, Canada's national sport is lacrosse.
That's right.
So, if we're talking about, what is Canada known for, it's always going to be hockey. From an NHL perspective, it was one of the things I thought the article did. One of that article, the CTV article, did a bad job on was kind of talking about the Canadian teams and how well we're doing. I don't know if that's a appropriate measure because, when you look at the number, I don't know the number exactly, but historically speaking, majority of the NHL is Canadians. I think right now the number is roughly 50%. It might have dropped. I know it used to be higher. It's basically, give or take 50% plus or minus, a percent or two. I'm sure it isolates over year. And I would assume it's going to continue to go down. As the sport becomes more prominent, you have more people from U.S. and European countries taking over in the NHL. So all that to say, I think we're just going to have more kids involved with basketball, whether that's basketball and hockey, that's basketball instead of hockey. I mean, obviously there's a huge cost barrier with regards to hockey. I think I remember reading an article from Hockey Canada a few years back that they were finally saying, yeah, you know what, youth enrollment as hockey is actually declining for the first time in forever. But that's more around the cost of the game, running rinks, all these things that are just, it's not a cheap sport, right? So
Right. No, when I think about the Raptors winning, like I said before, I was at a bar I can't remember what game it was. Maybe it was the Sixers or Milwaukee. I think it was Milwaukee Bucks game. And I grew up playing basketball. And for the first time ever, like I realized, like when I was watching the game in the bar, people were cheering every time the Raptors scored. And like, that's what they do in hockey. That's what that's what they do in baseball. That's what they do in soccer. Like in basketball, you don't cheer for every point. You know what I mean? Because there's a lot of points.
No, you cheer in the fourth quarter.
Well, you know what I mean? Yeah, but you don't cheer.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Of course,
you don't cheer every point. But it was awe-inspiring to me to see everybody cheering every time they scored a point. So I was like, okay, wow, this is a big deal. People are really hyped about this. So it was really a good feeling.
So I think, just because we're on the sports tick, I just want to give a little bit of shout outs for the listeners who are like, what about, we saw a very similar thing with Bianca Andreescu this year in tennis. So, she's going to have a similar catalyst, but it wasn't, it's not as much of a national sport.
Nobody's playing tennis,
Canada,
man.
Dude, this girl's 19 years old, beating Serena Williams at the U.S. Open, coming on the stage, like just taking over to some extent the way Serena did when she came on.
Soft things.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll just say, I think Toronto and basically, for the sports that only have one team, Canada's sports teams, I think you're going to expect to see all of our franchises out of the Toronto area competing, doing well over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I think so too.
I mean, as much as it's just the Raptors, you look at the Leafs,
Toronto FC,
in a good place, the Jays,
Toronto FC is playing
they're
well.
on the upswing. They've got a lot of young talent. TFC has been winning championships. So I think Toronto is going to be blessed with some good sports and some good playoff runs over the next little while. Championships, to be honest, it's hard to say. Darnell, what are your chances? What do you think the Raptors' chances are if they don't make any big plays or make any big signings of winning a championship again in the next 5 years?
Well, I don't. I think, like I said before, I think us experiencing the championship gives a lot of incentive to all the Toronto organizations to be like, oh, wait, so that's what it feels like, that's what it looks like to win a championship. I know a lot more teams are going to be like, okay, and they can learn something from Masai Ujiri in regards to how he was making big and controversial moves, not afraid to move DeMar DeRozan, not afraid to move some of your key players to try to, take it in one shot versus trying to build a championship team over a long term. So I know that was I know that'll be a lot of motivation for the for TFC, for the especially the Maple Leafs, right? They're like, oh man, they'll be like, oh man, it should have been us. but anyways, but that's how I see.
I think, it's what's interesting about that is that there's, arguably Toronto Raptors have had a hard time bringing talent in, and Masai, knowing that, basically took matters into his own hands. He didn't leave it in the players to sign with him.
Yeah.
And hopefully the fame or the all of that goes along with the Raptors doing as well as they did last year. Hopefully I'm hopeful that'll improve their ability to sign.
Yeah, because remember when he traded
top end talent.
Yeah, because when he traded for Kawhi, he didn't want to come here. And he wasn't planning to stay here, but technically you don't bring guys into your organization that don't want to be here. But I guess Masai was just doubling down and going all in, put all his eggs in one basket, and he, we came out on top. So that was really dope. Mm-hmm. But okay, let's move on.
Well, and I mean, he was No. I mean, I could keep talking about the Raptors because he just positioned himself in such a way that if things fell apart, he was basically ready to rebuild. But we're not there, so it's all good. Anyways, moving on to the next topic. Darn, number 4.
Drum roll. What the? Okay.
That was me whacking my table.
Event number 4.
Cannabis. And we've already done 2 podcasts on this. Well,
Yeah.
1.5.
Yeah, and we also went to
One
a
was on
conference.
the O Cannabis conference.
Right.
Yeah. So that's
Right.
why I said 1.5 podcasts.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Joel and I
Half was on the conference.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, Joel and I went to the O Cannabis conference and expo. It was on April 25th and 27th. So that was a lot of fun. And yeah, so we just got to
And that was episode 44.
Yeah, episode 44. Yeah, so check that out. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Way back on episode 10, we did our cannabis legalization episode.
We did?
And I'm pretty yeah.
Whoa.
We did, yeah. Darnell, we did an episode on legalization because it was we released it I guess early January 2018 because as of July 2018 Canada was legalizing cannabis for recreational use.
Right.
Now I think that actually didn't come into effect until like October because the government is very slow in passing their laws, but different problem. All that to say, I'm pretty pumped because our boy Anthony keeps tweeting at me. Didn't you predict this? Didn't you predict this? With all the ridiculous news that comes out, like how the Ontario Cannabis Company or whatever lost $40 million last year, or 40 was it billion or million? I don't know. They lost a bunch of money selling cannabis.
The Financial Post came out with an article called 2019 was a disaster for the cannabis sector, and there might be more trouble on the way in 2020. And so it features Greg Taylor of Purpose Investments and Van Mala Subramaniam of Financial Post Tone. And so they were basically talking about the problems that the private sector ran into in regards to navigating the legalization of cannabis. So the 3 things that were of major concern in 2019 for the cannabis industry was the vaping health scare, and hopefully we get to do an episode on that, looking deeper into it. People haven't switched from the black market to the legal market as they thought people would. Another issue was the branding changes, so take away the marketing restrictions on the private companies, as well as that there will be more U.S. states will opt for legalization and possibly steal the thunder from some of the Canadian cannabis industries. And what's unique about the U.S. situation is that both Republicans and Democrats are trying to fight for who's going to legalize it first.
Yeah, essentially it's sweeping the entire U.S. I mean, essentially you're getting, I think it's over 50% of the states now. Obviously it hasn't been done federally yet, which does create somewhat of an issue. But yeah, I mean, you know, when we did our O Cannabis conference, I don't know if we said it on the episode, but I know we talked about it, me and you at least. Canada has had a first mover advantage in that we legalized it first as a country. So arguably, you know, we were creating a environment for organizations to thrive here. But as your article kind of hints at, the way that Canada did it was in essence deeply regulated. And so, you know, there are, again, the economics hat that I put on, I've read some stuff that basically argues a government regulation is worse than in essence a socialized industry or a government monopoly. And that's just because you're adding extra costs to the market when you're regulating. I mean, cannabis was crazy level of regulation. when they first passed, it was like every inch of your facility had to have a camera on it. You couldn't have any dead spots. It wasn't like you just had to have the entrances and exits covered. You essentially had to have so much regulation about what you were allowed to do as a cannabis producer for the recreational industry, and technically the medical industry too. So all that to say that clearly this article indicates that the way Canada rolled out the program has not really worked out very well. That said, how do we still put this on our list? I think it's, the bigger issue around not so much, let's say, the companies in Canada or the industry in Canada, but for the customer. And this, I would argue, is going to be worldwide, not just Canada. Things like the products that are going to come out of the industry. So, and I'm not just talking about cannabis. I'm thinking along the lines of hemp. I can put there's a documentary from 2007 called The Union, The Business of Getting High, that really broke down some of it's more US based, but it does a good job of demonstrating how cannabis and hemp essentially were both made illegal at the same time. And it started out, one was used to make the other illegal, and then it turned around and they used the other one. Like, it's kind of convoluted, but if you watch it, if anyone's interested, where that's interesting is because, things like paper or other products arguably are more appropriately made with hemp products or hemp, pulp and the stalk of the plant. The cannabis and hemp plant is more of a highly renewable resource. Its growth cycle is vastly different than a tree, and similar. The problem is that the technology and machinery to process these things hasn't really been modernized. Now, obviously, that's starting to happen, but when you're competing with industries that have been, let's say, legal for 100 years, no one's really been spending the money or time doing development of processing for a plant or a resource that essentially was illegal. And in the US, hemp literally was illegal for the last 100 years. So we're talking no THC, no psychoactive product. Essentially, it's just a plant that has been illegal, and that's where I think one of the biggest pieces is of this industry, or why cannabis is gonna be forward-looking, impactful, is because of really hemp alongside with the cannabis market growing with respect to development and new products. I got an article, I'll put it in the show notes page, that just talked about the 7, what is it? It's titled "Perfect Plant?" 7 great uses for industrial hemp. I'll just read the headlines. 1, clothing. 2, food and beverages. 3, paper. 4, building supplies. 5, plastics. 6, fuel. 7, chemical cleanup. So yeah, I think that's just the, not even medical. That's the alternative product, being hemp. What about you, Darnell? From the other side of the article that you quoted, what do you think, or what makes cannabis on your list, or why you think cannabis belongs on our list?
Well, I think that when we look at the intended consequences, so everybody was planning there was just a lane for everybody to run in. So you had the security aspect, testing, lab service, packaging and supplies, pest control, storage, HVAC, technology, online stores, soil, labeling, licensed producers, the hydroponics, construction, air control, nutrients, extraction, horticulture, consultant, greenhouse systems, agriculture, media, engineering, insurance, vaping, clinics, cultivation, pharmaceutical, and the list goes on. Everybody had a lane to run, but of course, because of all the regulations, it's made it difficult for people to run in their lane. But what we see also is like these unintended consequences in regards to the negative aspects of legalizing cannabis that we're dealing with, and we're going to see the consequences going into 2020. So we're going to see a negative impact on the healthcare system in that people are going to start experimenting more. Also, the mental health aspect in regards to young people smoking. Like, yeah, we don't want them to smoke, but guess what? They're going to smoke. And now that everybody says it's legal, now they have more incentive to say, get off my damn back, mom. It's legal now. Everybody's doing it. Right? And then you also have the transportation industry with people driving high. Right? So these are the things going forward that, you know, especially as Canadians, we're going to see an increase in the madness,
well,
so
and,
to speak.
To play devil's advocate, I would say the impact is essentially unknown. Right? So, you know, what is the impact going to be on, let's say, driving? Right? What is the impact going to be on children? You know, underage usage, let's call it. You know, what is the impact, you know, with regards to, let's just say, drug abuse? Now that it's legal versus when it was illegal, you know, to some extent, we don't know. Like, these are all hypothetical potential problems. Or, hypothetical.
So are you saying that people aren't driving high now?
I'm saying the question is it happening more? Right? Now that it's legal. Right? So, what, or like, are people, so before it was legal, I mean, I think I read a stat, something like 50% of Canadians had smoked weed. Now, I don't know if I think that was like, I think it was actually like 50% smoked weed in the past year or something like that. Like, essentially, Canada had a really high number of, let's just say, you know, somewhat, you know, non or somewhat recreational users, even though it was illegal. So the question I have is, let's say usage does go up to whatever that number looks like. Are there going to be a significant amount of people driving? Like, yes, people are going to drive high. Yeah, just like, yes, people drive drunk. Like, it happens. It sucks. It's horrible. It shouldn't happen, right? We don't want people, you know, on the road in a manner that they look like Tiger Woods when he got pulled over. Do you know the Tiger Woods scenario I'm talking about?
No, but go ahead, keep going.
Oh, he was on prescription medication and didn't realize that how essentially he was stoned out of his tree. And there's a you know, a photo of him in the whatever, what's those pictures called when they arrest you? His mugshot. His mugshot is like, it's bad. Anyways, but the idea, like, you don't want people on the road that can't control their vehicle. So the question is, now that it's illegal, is that going to increase significantly? Right? Because if, let's say, 0.002% of people drive drunk, and we're going to see a similar stat with cannabis, is that a significant change? Is it really just the people who used to drive drunk are now willing to drive high? Like, again, I mean, these are all just, I'm posing questions to say, like, it's a potential problem. We don't know that it's a problem. Ideally, people should be knowledgeable enough to say, this isn't safe, I'm not going to do it. So, because the other side of it, like you referenced the medical industry, right? The counter argument, or a different argument would be the opioid crisis. And actually having cannabis as legal may actually help that problem. It might help reduce the opioid crisis. It might help deal with some of the fentanyl toxicity issues, because now we have less people using opioids, less people getting addicted to opioids, less people now accidentally taking fentanyl-laced products because they can no longer support their addiction because their prescription ran out. Or instead of trying to to get illegal opioids, they're going to cannabis to transition away because there's less side effects and all these other things. Like, again, all this to say, one of the things I'll say I'm excited about to some extent with cannabis is there's a huge opioid epidemic. And I mean, I've heard enough, I think a couple of NFL players saying, like, essentially, I know it's illegal for us to smoke, but I'm more willing to smoke weed than take the drugs they prescribe me because those drugs mess me up. If I come back from football practice and smoke so I can relax, that's much better than being on the couch as a zombie and a write-off for my family because of these pain pills that they gave me. And then the last thing I'll just say, I'll put an article in the show notes page, and it should basically reiterate what I'm going to say is within the body we have an endocannabinoid system, and that's what THC and other cannabinoids within cannabis react with. I think, from the stuff that I've read, basically we started studying it with respect to, or it started to become understood in regards to THC, but the full comprehension of our endocannabinoid system is really limited, at least with respect to how does it all work. There's an understanding that it impacts the following. So through the receptors that are part of the endocannabinoid system, here's the list of functions that it helps to regulate: appetite, digestion, immune function, inflammation, mood, sleep, reproduction, fertility, motor control, temperature regulation, memory, pain, pleasure, reward. So basically the point is the endocannabinoid system, which cannabis interacts with, actually influences all these parts of our body. Cannabis has over 100 cannabinoids, THC and CBD being the two most prominent. And what I'm looking forward to, or what I'm excited about, I would say from a health nutritional standpoint, is that endocannabinoid system is going to be continued to studied further now. Now that especially if the U.S. gets it off the Schedule 1 list, that's the biggest problem, I would say, with regards to studies or testing, is that because it's a Schedule 1 drug in the U.S., there's a huge limitation on the amount of studying that has happened and will continue to happen until that actually gets removed. And so that's why, to me at least, that's why this is on the list, because cannabis being something I think we largely don't understand medically or, pharmacologically. And now as it's becoming legal from a recreational perspective, it's going to be better understood medically as well.
It's going to be fascinating to see what happens in the next 5 to 10 years. Moving on to number 3. So it was the walkout by the students in the Toronto District School Board for Friday, September 27th. And so students in Toronto across Canada were basically planning to participate in a climate change rally. And so the Toronto District School Board is one of several institutions taking measures to support students who plan to walk out of class as part of the global call to action. The Toronto District School Board said in a note to parents Monday that will ensure students receive no academic penalty for taking part in the rally by asking its schools to avoid scheduling tests and assessments on that day. The rallies, dubbed Global Climate Strike, are timed to coincide with the United Nations Climate Action Summit in New York. And so the movement is partly inspired by Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, who has staged weekly demonstrations over the past year under the hashtag Fridays for Future, calling on world leaders to step up efforts against climate change. And that was an article from CTV News.
So, for me, I would say the walkout aspect of this is largely irrelevant. We can hash that out in a second. But I think, for me, it's more about the climate change component of this issue. I would say I think the walkout is irrelevant because these kids aren't sacrificing anything. these kids are basically going to school for free, doing something or they don't want to do to some extent, and then they're skipping class. And so I don't know how meaningful the walkout actually was. I'm sure there's plenty of kids that were 100% on board with the, let's call it the mission. But there's how many of the kids that walked out were just like, I get to skip class, I'm in. So that's where my questioning of the significance of the actual walkout lies. But I think the climate change conversation, whether it be around regulating the use of fossil fuels, whether it be carbon taxes, whether it be renewable energy subsidization, all of that aspect, I think, is going to continue to be a significant issue politically, as well as it's going to impact us financially, because carbon taxes aren't, as much as they want to say they're revenue neutral. I mean, you're increasing the cost of something, and we've talked about this stuff a little bit before, but if you look at energy prices in Ontario over the last 10, 15 years, they've just gone through the roof. And arguably it has to do with the green energy contracts that are so expensive. And obviously there's an argumentation that we're trying to invest in the future. That, just to play a bit of rebuttal to that, the argument against that is that, think of, I don't know how much the listeners are familiar with R&D kind of subsidization by the government, but in general, when you're subsidizing R&D, you actually have to show development. So it's not just research, it's development of a product in order to qualify for tax incentives and credits and whatnot. The economics argument is that you over-incentivize development at the cost of research. So if you look at green energy today, the argument or the criticism of it is that it can't hold enough capacity to actually be sustainable for the energy needs of let's call it the city or the region. And consequently, we're not, I would argue, we're not spending enough money actually developing that technology to make, let's say, batteries hold more or batteries cheaper or whatever the component around, i.e. more research, more innovation, such that that product becomes viable financially on its own. And so all that to say that this is such a muddied industry. It's such a I would vote for removing all government subsidies, both gas and green energy. And let's start actually seeing what the costs of these alternatives are, without such deep government influence, so that we can start to see where things should go. So for me, this is on our list. It's important because we're going to continue. I mean, Canada alone is in the place where some provinces are going to start fighting with the federal government over the carbon taxes that the federal government's trying to put in, and provinces, you've got the Liberals versus the Conservatives on the provincial versus the federal level, essentially going to court.
Well, I was pretty concerned with what I saw and a bit worried in that, so I believe that, there's no such thing as a neutral education. And so all schools have an agenda, and they always should have an agenda. All education is geared to creating a particular kind of person. I'm worried we are raising a generation that cannot think for themselves, but that only adhere to a mob mentality. Students being encouraged to walk out of class and protest in particular things, that's socio-political engineering, and it's done intentionally. So it's not random. So I really do believe that this will have a huge impact going into 2020, because those students will one day become, voters, and also policymakers and politicians. And you already see where their allegiances lie politically, and so you will see a greater impact in the climate change movement on the country. So again, when you look at the economics of it and the inefficiencies of climate change alarmism, people should be worried. But I think it's very important to just make sure that we're not being terrorized or scared of climate change alarmism and like scaring us into the way we vote or interpret policies or opposing information.
Yeah, I think when I look at this conversation, what frustrates me, you look at someone like Greta Thunberg,
who is Time Person of the Year.
Yeah, which I did a little bit of research on Time Person of the Year. There's no claim to, let's say, the quality of that person's arguments or that position. It's just a matter of
who had the greatest impact on
their
on
prominence.
the world. Yeah.
So Hitler was Time Person of. Not necessarily even impact. I think
Hitler was Time Person of the Year.
Most famous. Yeah. I mean, I think it was like 37. So like, it was like when I remember reading about it, it was like well before the war.
Well, that's cool.
But in general, it was his polarization of his character that caused him to be the Time Person of the Year.
Mm-hmm.
I think they there's some weird ones too. They picked a people group. Like, I don't remember what it was. I say people group because I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was like something like, let's say the Tea Party in, when they were doing the Boston Tea Party, or the Tea Party protests when I think Occupy Wall Street, something like that, where it was like a random group of people was the Time Person of the Year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more about the fame and the prominence and all of the hoopla around that person. Not so much time kind of validating anything along the person or their character or anything like that. So I'm not trying to say it's less meaningful, but it's not about their message as it is as much about how much hype and news they create. In regards to her, the thing that I look at her and she embodies or she represents this movement. There's a lack of discourse in general, in my opinion, around this issue, right? There's no obviously the children that are being put forward, similar to David Suzuki's daughter 20 years ago, they don't, let's say, have an opinion or even have thoughts about how do we solve this. There's just, hey, here's a problem. You guys are ignoring it. And we're just on board with, let's just say, the government solution, which is carbon taxes. If someone was to say to them, well, carbon taxes aren't actually doing anything, they're a horrible solution, here's why they suck, here's an alternative. Well, in essence, those people are, the children are still kind of on side with the let's just tax everything solution. And the reason I bring that up is to say, the biggest criticism or the best criticism that I've always heard put towards the green team, if you want to call it that, is the lack of support of nuclear. Because technically speaking, nuclear is the greenest or the cleanest and the cheapest. I'm, total sidebar, but just to say, I think this is an issue that we will continue to talk about and will continue to get headlines. And I think, the next decade might be really telling. Maybe some of the speculations will come true, or maybe they'll fall flat on their face. And I would say again, but that's another podcast to keep going on that road.
And for those of you who didn't check out our episode on climate change, Sola Greta, episode 55, Yeah, please check it out, and you'll hear Joel and I expound more on climate change and Greta Thunberg. We talked about behavioral economics, economics of climate change policies, public discourse regarding the science of climate change, correlation versus causation. So it was a really good episode. So yeah, please check that out. Okay, so let's look at number 2.
Jordan Peterson.
Okay, so why is Jordan Peterson on the list?
Well, I think we chose Jordan Peterson because of the name recognition. I think there's so much associated with his name that
Hold on.
I think.
Hold on. For those people who don't know who Jordan Peterson is, he's a clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Toronto, and he rose to prominence in his opposition to Bill C-16, which is speaking in gender pronouns, which he refused to do. And so in him refusing to that, the whole thing blew up, and then he became insta-famous. All right.
And to steelman his position, he did not oppose using someone's preferred pronoun. He opposed the fact the government largely made it a hate crime and compelled speech. So his issue was in regards to the fact the way the law is written, you're creating the government's compelling of speech, which is much different than any other sort of regulation in Canada with regards to speech. So because we technically don't have free speech in Canada the way the U.S. does, but this was, to some extent, or I would say his argument for why he stood up was it was a new territory and they were crossing a line that he thought was very dangerous and a slippery slope. But, all that goes along with him, I think he's representative of the bipartisanship that we see in society today. So for me, that's why, when I think of him as number 2, it's not that I think Jordan Peterson is going to be impactful in the next generation or the next 5 years, as much as what was the conditions or the environment that caused his rise to fame to even exist. That is more so what I see as impactful. What about you, Darnell? Would you agree with that, or do you see it a little bit differently?
No, I agree with what you're saying, but I look at it from the other side of the coin. I think his ideas will have a greater impact on the next 5 to 10 years. So, for example, so he's not nihilistic in his thinking. Nihilism meaning there's no such thing as meaning in anything. So he's very big on reality. And then he also makes a charge to young men who are lacking purpose or meaning in life. So he's always talking about cleaning up your room and pushing this idea of before you start, calling out for your rights, you should be taking responsibility for your actions. So he's very, he believes in individualism, in that the individual brings the greater change versus the majority, but the individual has the capacity to change the world. And I think from a biblical perspective, I think, the Bible also gives a charge to men that, the problems that we're generally having in culture is because of men and men not being responsible. So I really think that the charge to young men to be responsible for their actions and for their families will have a great impact in the next 5 to 10 years.
I would pretty much agree with that. I think that's a fair statement. I think I actually go to some extent a different place for the most part, though, with my thoughts about him. And what I mean by that is, in regards to our bipartisan kind of culture right now, I think it's interesting the environment we find ourselves in. And you talked about nihilism, and I would say I agree. I think it's to some extent there's this idea that underlies nihilism being postmodernism. If I was giving postmodernism a fair kind of presentation, I would say it's this idea that we as individuals only know things through our subjective experience. And so there's a challenge that says, well, even if someone's trying to write about objective truth, they only know it subjectively. And so you kind of have to deconstruct ideas in order to evaluate, did a bias play a role in the way that someone interpreted the idea or presented the idea. And I would say that's a fair presentation or a fair critique even of ideas. Where I think Jordan Peterson takes issue, where I think it goes too far and essentially in line with nihilism, is this idea that there is no such thing as objective truth, or we can't know it at all. And I think that is that postmodernist idea gave rise to a number of things that I think Jordan Peterson is in a response to. And that would include things like postmodernism, to some extent, is at the base for cancel culture. It's at the base for identity politics. It's at the base for critical race theory. It's at the base of intersectionality. And I say that because intersectionality starts to say, well, okay, we're going to value an opinion not based on how true it is or how objectively true an idea is, but we're going to take someone's ideas and hold them up as more important based on how oppressed you are. And that's just, it only comes out of the idea that no, we don't start from objective truth. Right? We're not looking for objective truth. We're just looking for the person who's the most oppressed, and we need to elevate them, therefore, whatever they say. And so that's, when it comes to the gender pronoun stuff, it's like, well, you're taking an oppressed person and saying, well, okay, when I experience X, Y, and Z, it's a problem. And maybe that's right. Like, the idea of, if someone's transgendered and they're living a lifestyle as a man and they were born a woman, and someone's harassing them and calling them she, like, okay, yeah, it's a problem, but it's called harassment. It doesn't matter that, in my opinion, it doesn't matter what form the harassment takes, it's still harassment. We already have a law for that. And I would say, I think that's where Jordan Peterson's position comes from. So all of that to say that, you also have things like Antifa and socialism no longer being a dirty word, coming to rise in I would say under the same culture, under the same scenarios that give rise to Jordan Peterson. So when I look towards the next 5 years, I would say to some extent this bipartisanship has to resolve. Like, I would say we're stress testing our political system. When Donald Trump gets elected and you can find footage of people beating up a Trump supporter for being a Trump supporter, to me that demonstrates that the democratic system is failing, because the voting is to prevent violence. But in the way that society is shaping itself right now, your team lost, therefore you got to go to war. And so I don't know. It's there's some aspects of this culture. What happens if Trump gets reelected? You look at the election in Canada that just happened. Arguably, Trudeau did all the things that would have required cancel culture to take him out with regards to blackface and whatnot. But it didn't. And the only argument that I would put forth as to the rational reason as to why it didn't is because the left uses cancel culture to get what they want. They don't actually care about canceling people. So when you look at Trudeau, well, he represented what they want. So they know that, canceling him would actually be bad for what they want. So for me, I think Jordan Peterson's ideas are good. And like you said, men being more responsible is very important to move forward as a society. But I also think that the environment that gave rise to him is going to come to a tipping point, and it has to resolve, and I hope it resolves peacefully.
All right, finally, the number one event that happened in the last 5 years that will impact the next 5 years is
Bitcoin. And for some of our listeners, that might be a 4-letter word to you, in that you have no idea what I'm talking about. But for some of our listeners, they're going to be criticizing me for using Bitcoin. In general, I'm using Bitcoin, or I think Bitcoin makes sense to use as the reference here. Not because I'm actually speaking about Bitcoin or we think Bitcoin in and of itself, but more so the underlying technology of Bitcoin, which is referred to as distributed ledger technology. And distributed ledger technology is something that really changes the way things have to be done. In essence, we've historically had centralized ledgers in order to prevent fraud, right? So think of it in the sense of, I have a bank account with CIBC. CIBC does the due diligence to make sure any errors are corrected. They do things to make sure my bank account says what I expect it to be. Distributed ledger technology, and Bitcoin being the currency use of distributed ledger technology, the ledger is decentralized in such a way that it makes it immutable. That's not, and so, that's where in the past we've required gatekeepers in order to ensure the safety of my assets on a private ledger, let's call it. The public ledger is something that is innovative, and it's something that I'm excited about, because for technology speaking sense, I think for the listener who's thinking like, what are you talking about, Joel? Cryptocurrency, like whatever, it's nothing, it's not a big deal. Well, the way that I think I'm stealing this from somebody else, but I've heard it. The analogy was, if you look at the internet and you take the application of email. Email was in essence the very first, customer facing or consumer facing use of the internet. Well, when it first rolled out, it wasn't easy to use. It took 4 hours to send a paragraph to your buddy down the street. And it was really the guy who knew how to code was the only guy who could use it. Because, like when we type in a website, how it says HTTP before it? Well, you used to have to use that kind of protocol in order to send an email. Today, your grandma can use an email and have no concept of how it works. So the analogy is, well, Bitcoin is really the infant first application that's still not easy to use. Your grandma can't use Bitcoin without having to do a little bit of research and start to understand it. So what I'm trying to get at is, when email is like it is today, well, the internet produces something like Amazon. So 20 years, 25 years down the road, we get something like Amazon that you would have never imagined when we had email. And I would say cryptocurrency, being that first technology, is really coming, at the end. Basically, it was 2017 when cryptocurrency kind of, and more so Bitcoin, took a rise to fame, if you want to call it that. I mean, the price of Bitcoin went from just under $1,000 to its peak, or all-time peak, in 2017 of about $17,000. Actually, 19,000 is what I have on this. On December 17th, 2017, $19,000 on this CoinDesk website that I'm looking at right now. So that's the reason it became popular was because of the financial side of things. It right now the price has dropped back down to about 7,000 $7,000 for one Bitcoin. So the idea that I'm trying to get at here is the technology side, that it's an innovation that we don't fully know what is that going to look like. A good example that I think the listeners can appreciate is with respect to land deeds. I mean, in Canada, we're blessed. In North America, we're blessed with knowing, if I own my property, nobody can, no government official can come along and just by a stroke of pen pretend like it's not mine. But in third world countries, that is the case, right? One of the biggest problems in Africa in general, nobody's building on their land because the corrupt government official could come along and just write on a piece of, by a stroke of a pen, change it, and you no longer own it and someone else does. But if you were to put the actual land deeds onto a distributed ledger, there is no ability for that government official to do what they're doing in third world countries. And so this is where, things like this is underway. I'd say more so probably at a North American standpoint, but as we roll out the crypto technology to other applications, we're going to see innovations that we really almost can't comprehend. Another one that, again, for the listener, you may or may not know, there's a lot of issues around stocks and who actually owns them. And so a lot of times you actually have more claims to a stock than there are stocks. So what I mean by that is there's 100 stocks. Well, 105 people think they own the stock. That might sound a little absurd to you. It is absurd. But that is actually the environment that we live in because of the way things are done. So cryptocurrency is again, just the first application of this technology. And I'm personally, I listen to quite a bit of podcasts on crypto and where things are going. And I'm pretty excited because I think we're going to have a lot of innovation that we can't even comprehend, but will significantly change the way we do things. So I know my little tirade was a bit long there, Darnell, but for you, what level of knowledge would you say you have of Bitcoin and whatnot? And for the listener, what excites you about it, or what makes you think it's going to be impactful?
My level of knowledge knows enough to know that it's important, and that it's definitely a technology that needs to continue to develop, and I don't think people should be afraid of. So, for example, right, the reason why I think that it should be number one on the list is because, one, like the basic principle is that innovation helps move societies forward, like in the Industrial Revolution, and how it advanced Europe and how it advanced America. And we also see God's command for innovation in the cultural mandate in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 28, and also in Genesis 9:1, where God tells us to use his creation to cultivate for human flourishing. Right? We shouldn't be afraid of the technology, but I think that, especially when you're talking about cryptocurrency and being able to purchase online without the middleman overseeing or mediating your transactions online, which frees up the market, so people can do more business between each other. That's great, but part of, I think, the concern, especially, I guess for me as a Christian, looking at, okay, well, getting involved in cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and the hype around it, people were kind of torn, like, is this gambling? Dr. Herschel York, professor of Christian preaching at Southern Seminary, has some great insights into the difference between gambling and investing. What gambling is basically bad stewardship. It's like playing the lottery, right? Because the whole point of playing the lottery is to get money, essentially greed, right? So gambling goes against the ethic of, working for yours. With gambling, there's winners and losers. And also, not to get into it, but, like playing the lottery is like a regressive tax on the poor, right? So gambling and risk aren't the same thing. So risks, there isn't winners or losers, but there's usually mostly winners, right? So when you're taking a risk, you're investing. So investment is for others to profit. So I want that company to succeed, and everybody wins, right? So we're really looking at, okay, fine, I'm going to invest in Bitcoin, right? But then you also have to wrestle with ethical investment and unethical investment. I think Bitcoin is an ethical investment because it helps us to move the economy forward by encouraging free trade. And so I think that's going to be a huge thing for us as Canadians and people around the world to do, especially for us who are in a first world country and who have family, and who, for some of us of Canadians who've come from a third world country, and we want to send money back home. So now we can efficiently send money back home through this new technology without a middleman. So we can do more to help our family abroad. So I think it's a good idea, but we should still be cautious and really looking at that this isn't a perfect means yet. Like, it's still developing. So in the article by Joe Carter, who's an editor for the Gospel Coalition, and so he talks about what are the advantages of Bitcoin. And so the advantages of using Bitcoin are mostly ideological. So there are 4 main groups of people who are attracted to Bitcoin system. So he talks about people who are obsessed with privacy, people who despise the government, people who are interested in online experiments, and people who are interested in economic speculation. And then he talks about what are the disadvantages, the potential disadvantages. So he talks about the convertibility, the instability, and limited protection against fraud. Either way, how you slice it, you still want to use discernment and wisdom and navigating and investing to help promote the economy.
Well, and I think, there's some, again, we're not giving investment advice, just to be
right. Yeah, that's right.
To hear that disclaimer. There's an aspect where I think, I think you laid it's a good point you made about comparing, gambling and investing. But I think it's easy for some people to actually invest in a manner that is essentially gambling. And just take there's a simple investing principle of diversification. And if you're putting all of your money into high risk assets, like all of your money is in cryptocurrency, or you have all your money in penny stocks. I mean, I would argue, are you just playing the lottery? Right? Is your goal to win? You're just hoping one of them hits it big and you make it big. I would say that's not investing. That's playing the lottery. Right. That's poor stewardship. But to say, hey, I'm going to take 5% of my portfolio, 20% of my portfolio, and put it into high risk things, that's that's following the diversification, principle. So I just thought it was a good, to reiterate that, if you're, especially if you're, let's say, someone who's a day trader, if you're taking, you're day trading and you're trying to make a bunch of money, but you're doing it in a manner that you're putting yourself at such a risk that if something was to unfold in a manner that's not good, you could lose everything you have. And, you've got, it depends on your life situation. You're a 20-year-old, you have no responsibilities, and you have 10 grand and you're doing something with it. Not a big deal. You're 30 35 years old, 40 years old, and you've got a family to take care of, and you're taking 90% of your life savings and you're putting it into something, bad stewardship, whether you call it gambling or not. So I think you made, a really good point too, around cross-border. And I think that's something where, currency realm, trying to solve cross-border payments. I think there's an African-based cryptocurrency. I think it's called Walla or Dwala or something like that. I heard about it a while back. I think it's Walla. And they're just trying to solve the problem where, there's businesses or individuals that work with so many people in a region, and there's so many different currencies. And in essence, they're kind of providing a common currency with let's say relatively cheap on and off ramps. Whereas like right now, if you're trying to send money across the world, a lot of times it's not cheap to get money into a particular currency that's, let's say, a little bit less known or less common. You're paying a lot of transfer and a lot of fees. So that's a big aspect of the cryptocurrency where things are being, or problems are being solved, or at least trying to be. And I would just say, to play, I guess, devil's advocate for any of the listener thinking like, okay, well, why did you pick this innovation? For me at least, the thinking was, the next decade, the next 5 years, the next probably 20 years is going to have a significant amount of change due to technology or due to innovation. And the things that most people might think about and asking why we're not talking about is whether it's AI, automation, self-driving cars. And I think for us, the rationale here is that for most people, they actually understand what those things are and kind of know. Maybe AI is a little bit more, obscure. But for automation, we see self-checkout lines. We see, different things in life changing. You see the fact that when you go to McDonald's, you now order at a, screen instead of talking to an individual. Self-driving cars, we kind of know that, the trucking industry eventually will get, let's say, just impacted significantly if and when those things get approved to be on the road. For me, at least, the idea was those things kind of fall under this category of technology change, which I would see in the next decade. But I think for Bitcoin and distributed ledger technology, it's the impact on a larger scale is really unknown because the applications of this technology are so vast. I mean, we're talking about, like, literally distributed ledger technology can revolutionize gaming, right? Which when we're talking about, the listener might be saying, what do you mean? We were talking about Bitcoin. Like, how does that have to do anything to do with gaming? And it's really just the idea of, ordering of activities on a ledger that is trusted. So, think of it in terms of a first-person shooter game. For any of the listeners that are gamers out there, how many times you're like, I shot the guy, but I'm dead, and or complaining about lag on the internet. Well, the idea being that arguably distributed ledger technology can actually help make those things less of a problem. So, I mean, I'm not trying to claim that I know that that's what's going to happen, but the idea is that distributed ledger technology has applications far beyond, something like currency. But currency is an application where it's really interesting. The last thing I'll say is I remember listening to a podcast where they were talking about somebody this guy was mentioning that he was talking to regulators in the U.S. and different agencies and whatnot. And, as they're asking him questions for him to help educate them on cryptocurrencies and whatnot, he was kind of finding it ironic that the way that they're asking questions, they don't really understand that this technology will replace the regulator. And the rationale or the reasoning behind that is because something like Bitcoin or an alternative to Bitcoin will have a set of rules. And those rules are essentially what the regulator currently enforces. But the system will be designed in such a way that either you follow the rules or you're in another system. And so enforcement occurs at less, the regulator's role essentially gets eliminated because it's just automated. And arguably now you're in competition with what rules do you want? Hey, if I want to go to a scenario where I know that all the vendors provide certain level of, let's say warranty on products, arguably the currency system can enforce those rules because by transacting in a particular cryptocurrency, the rules of the game with that currency. So I know it's a bit of a, maybe a mind stretch for some people because they're like, compared to the way that we operate financially today, it's a bit foreign. But I think that's what makes it exciting, and that's what makes the changes that crypto will bring promising, but also really unknown.
Okay, cool. Like, if you guys have anything, if you guys disagree with our top 5, let us know. And yeah, you can hit us up on our Facebook group, and you can hit us up on Twitter at Sixth Sense Report on Twitter. If you're trying to get in touch with me, it's Darnell, or you're trying to get in touch with me, it's Dougudda Darnell, DOGUDDA_Darnell on Twitter, Instagram, and Darnell Samuels on Facebook.
And I'm at TJoelN39, and our the Sixth Sense Report, you can find it at drop the Sixth Sense Report at all social media. Well, Facebook and Twitter.
Sixth Sense makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?